Let's go ahead and get started. Our first speaker is going to be Miss Melanie Wilson, CEO of Cancer Care Services.
Thanks, Ray, and hi, everybody. I just wanted to say a few words as this is a very special topic to me. And on November 1st, 2011, my daughter, Lauren, died of cancer. And as hard as that was, I was blessed because Jane Oderberg worked with me. And Jane really was the primary person who walked me through my grief. And it's, to me, it just feels, I just feel awestruck that Jane is hosting us tonight and that I have the ability to connect with two men who also didn't even know me, but they've been a part of my grief journey too. And Patrick and Tim, through your words, you've walked with me through some very, very dark days. And so I want to thank you for being here tonight, not only for all of those of us on the call, but for me personally through my grief. And I know the holidays are filled with traditions and things that make me miss my daughter even more than any other time of the year. And so thank you for doing this in December when a lot of us are really keenly aware of the loss in our lives. So Jane, before I turn it over to you to introduce our wonderful speakers, I want to tell you how much I love and admire you, and thank you for being my guardian angel when I needed somebody to just let me say Lauren's name and let me talk about her and let me be real about how I felt. You were that person for me. And so, Jane, thanks for bringing us together tonight.
I'm Jane Oderberg. I worked at Cancer Care Services for 12 years as a social worker and as the program director. And when I retired in 2016, you never retire from Cancer Care Services, let me tell you. I became a volunteer. Well, I must have done that really well because then I wound up being on the board of directors. So, and every meeting, Melanie reminds us that you can serve 2 consecutive 3-year terms. So, and then you let, oh, that many? Oh, 3 consecutive? Oh, good grief.
No, that's 6 total years.
Oh, okay, 6 total years. I'm there forever. Because after you lay out for a year, you can come back. The reason why I wanted to share Getting Grief Right was because it helped me more than I can ever express. As a social worker, you figure, oh, you know how to handle grief, don't you? Sure. When it's somebody else's grief, I think I handle it better. My husband died after being ill for 8 years. And I was very with it, getting everything handled, getting everything taken care of, making sure my adult children were fine, making sure that my grandchildren were all okay, getting my daughter and her family here from California. And so after several months of this, I kept going, why am I not crying? Why am I feeling relief instead of sadness? There's got to be something the matter with me. So I called several of my friends who are psychologists, and I said, if I was your patient and I needed to go see somebody for grief work, where would you send me? And they all said, Dr. Patrick O'Malley. Well, I had heard Dr. O'Malley speak many times in my career, and I thought, okay, why not? Shot him off an email and said, here is me. I would like to schedule some time with you. And I did. And he, of course, oh, tell me your story. So I'm telling him my story, and I'm saying, why am I not crying? Why am I not upset? Why do I feel relief? And I'm embarrassed that I feel relief that my husband of 40, whoever many years it was, 47, I think, he's died. And he said, well, how long was he sick? I said, 8 years. And he said, you did 8 years worth of grieving before the fact. Aha! It was remarkable that he said that. And I went, I think you're right. And on the first anniversary of Simon's death, we were at the cemetery, and I finally cried. I too have this book, Getting Grief Right. You probably can't see it with the backdrop, but that's okay. And I had read it, and it was wonderful. And so if you haven't read the book, you'll understand when you do. And I did, and I got good, but I didn't read it the right way, as I was told. I went back and read it again, and I read it and followed the instructions of what you're supposed to do. And it was remarkable. I have recommended it to patients I've worked with, to just anybody who says, what's the best grief book you ever wrote? So I expect royalties coming in sometime soon, I hope, because it always is at the top of my list. So I read it the right way. I also got the opportunity, because my granddaughter had a very difficult time with Simon's death. And she was going to the warm place. And she came, she said to her mother, everybody knows stories about their grandparents, but I don't really know anything about Pop. And my daughter said, well, you know what, neither do I, because he would never talk about anything. So I got to tell his story to Mia, and it kind of brought everything together to who he was and why she and he really had this love affair. It's unbelievable. But it helped bring closure yet again for me, being able to share all about him to her and let her carry that on with her. So I want to thank both Tim and Dr. O'Malley for spending some time with us this evening. And now I will turn it over to them.
Well, I'll take the lead here and ask Tim to pitch in just a second. But Jane, thank you so much for that. And Melanie, I appreciate your kind words, and all the staff folks that we've gotten to visit with for a few minutes. It's good to meet you, and so pleased that you've asked us to do this. It's a time of unprecedented, both of living loss, which we'll talk a little bit about towards the end. But let me talk about what I want to talk about tonight. I want to start and tell you a little bit about how the book came to be, and then I will share my story in terms of how I came to want to write this book. And I'm going to ask Tim to share his story, and we'll talk about in a minute how that brought us together. And then I'll go through some of the main points of the book. We'll talk about the sort of the guts of the deal in terms of the conclusions we came to and what we write about. And then I want to talk about community and the absolute essentialness of having good community and being good community. And then we'll end, I think, with some conversation about the times we're in and how the pandemic has changed our normal ways of being together, our normal ways of being with the dying, our normal ways of being bereaved, and sort of talk about the living loss of what's happened with that. So Tim and I really had two missions with the book that we'll talk about in the middle section, which is how do we provide relief to the griever, to those who grieve? Because what I was seeing in my practice was a great deal of self-criticism of folks who came to see me because they thought they weren't grieving right. And the other mission that we had was to try and support the community, to help helpers be better helpers. And so that's where we'll get to in just a second. But how did we get started? We sort of argue about this date. I think we never have pinned it down, but we're sort of two chapters to the Tim and Pat story, Patrick's story. One is we got together decades ago because we found out we each had a relationship with someone that had a relationship with each other. And we talk about that in the book. And these two characters are Fred Rogers and Henry Nouwen. I had a circumstance in which I was able to be with Henry Nouwen. And of course, Tim had a very deep relationship with Fred Rogers. So that put us in contact with each other, I'm going to say 35 years ago. And we got to know each other, and we were right smack in the middle of our lives at that point, and had kind of a long break without much contact. And then several years ago, I heard back from Tim, and he said, I'm writing a novel, and I don't think that my characters are psychologically impaired enough. Could you pitch in? And I said, I can do that. I can make your characters less healthy than you've made them. And so I said, let's do a trade-off. I will read your novel, and I guess what I said is kind of pathologize your characters. But let's talk about this idea, which we talked about a few years before, about a book. And I'll put a proposal together, and I'd like you to look at that. And so we met at Angelo's, and I traded the manuscript with my edits back to him, and he had read through my proposal. And in true journalistic form, he said a phrase I'd heard before. He says, you know, you buried the lead. And I says, what are you talking about? He says, you're like a footnote in this in terms of your own loss. And if you're going to write a book about loss and expect people to want to share their loss, you need to talk about your loss. That needs to be more primary. Well, that was the beginning of our collaboration. He was absolutely right. I think I was sort of hiding behind trying to be a writer and not really being as vulnerable as I could have been and ultimately became by writing my own story. And so that began our process. The next big thing that happened, we put a proposal together, and it was, I'm going to say, the fall of 2014, I noticed we had the proposal together, and we're trying to get this off to different publishers or agents. And I noticed that the New York Times had a series called Couch. And it was a series that therapists and therapy patients were writing into. And I said, you know, you've got a lot of credibility because Mr. Rogers' book, I don't have much at all. I'm going to take a shot at this. So I wrote an article, and it was January of 15 when I got it sent in. And I think I sent it in on a Monday, and I heard from the editor on a Tuesday, and it ran in the Sunday edition. And the name of the article was Getting Grief Right. And it was a story about a woman who had come to see me after her baby had died from sudden infant death syndrome. And she was sort of the embodiment of this person, of so many folks I saw, a very high achieving person, what I call a high achiever griever. And she was bound and determined to get it right. And she knew she must not be getting it right because she'd read Kubler-Ross, and she was stuck at this stage and not in that stage. And so I asked her, as the article suggests, to tell me her story. And she resisted, but I had credibility because she knew that I was a bereaved parent as well. And so she ultimately opened up. Well, it was certainly exciting for all that to happen in terms of that getting published. But what we discovered was that there was a message here from the response that we were needing to pursue. It really inspired us to continue the mission to try and get this published. And the next day we had an agent, and so that all happened fairly quickly. And it turned out to be one of the most emailed articles in the newspaper's history, which again is lovely to hear. But the point being that it appeared that how this was getting framed to understand grief in a different way was meeting a hunger that I think a lot of grieving folks had had. So that's how we got there. Book was, we worked on that all of 15 and into 16 and sent it off, and finally was published in summer of 2017 in July. Now, my story starts at beginning of my practice. I was fresh out of graduate school in 1979, and I started into practice in 1980. My first son, Ryan, was born. He was born premature and lived the first 6 months of his life in a neonatal intensive care unit. He came home to be with us. We thought we were out of the woods, so to speak, and he came home to be with us in March of '81, and then died suddenly in May of that year. And so while he had a host of problems, we were not anticipating, after all we'd gone through, that he would die. So going back to work, probably much too quickly, but I did. Over time, I started just getting a lot of referrals for grieving folks because the word had sort of gotten out that there was a therapist in town who also had loss. And the majority of those folks were bereaved parents. And I felt very ill-equipped to do this work because those of you who've had graduate training, unless yours was better than mine, I got very little training in grief in my graduate program. I mean, it was a little chapter tucked into family life stage. And so there just really wasn't much information out there, except what had been popularly published, which was Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. So that's all I had to go with. So as that year, 81, 82, 83, 84, I dug in to try and understand the steps and stages of grief, and I used it as a model in my work and actually as almost a diagnostic tool to try and help me see where people were in their grief. Quietly, I was trying to apply all that to myself and not feeling like I was getting anywhere, but the premise was, I think, ultimately wrong, which was that I was trying to get somewhere, that I was trying to get to this sense of resolution, the sense of acceptance. And as many of you know, Kubler-Ross's population were not grieving folks. Her population were dying folks. They were oncology patients. And I would say with the oncology patients I work with, there is more of the 5 stages that I see that they go through. But what happened was it then got applied to grief. And there's been much written and much speculation about should that have been done? Did she do the right thing? Her co-author on the grief book, David Kessler, recently came out with another book, and he's added another step to grief. And he claims, and I believe him, that neither of what that step is after acceptance is finding meaning. And David wrote his book after he'd been, of course, doing grief training for years, but he ended up with a son that died. And he was watching himself go through this and realized that there really had to be more after acceptance. And David writes, and Dr. Kubler-Ross wrote that they did not mean it to be prescriptive, that they meant it to be descriptive. And I believe him about that. But I think folks were so hungry to find the map to navigate, and I being one of them, I made it prescriptive. And I think it got into popular culture and became very prescriptive. So I was doing that, not feeling very satisfied myself, not sure I was being very helpful to my clients. And over time began to realize, and we tell the story in the book, I'll just tell this brief story about a client named Scott, who came to see me after his father died. Didn't want to be there. His wife and his pastor said he was drinking too much. So he was there under duress, which is never a great start for a therapy session. So I gave him all sorts of room on that and said, if this doesn't work out, you did one session, you'll make the family happy, and we'll say goodbye. Well, I presented the Kubler-Ross model to him. He was a construction guy, and I said, this can kind of be like a blueprint. He ought to get into this. And he really blew it off and said, to him, it sounded like a bunch of hooey. And at that point, I couldn't disagree. So Scott just started talking. And he told the story of he and his dad, they're growing up together, him coming into the business. And at the end of this, I thought to myself, you know, Scott I'm not doing anything for him. I haven't had an intervention. I haven't analyzed where he is with his grief. And I felt pretty inadequate. But it started occurring to me through that moment and many other moments that telling his story was his therapy. He looked disappointed when we had to end. And I said, you know, you can come back if you want to. He says, yeah, I'll give it another shot. He came back and he walked all the way through the story up into his dad's death. And at that point, he began to weep and to begin to open up about it. And it was, again, at this point, mid-'80s, where I really was questioning. I'd gone to therapy myself several times. I'd seen a Gestalt therapist. I'd talked to the empty chair. I'd written letters. I'd done all of this stuff trying to find resolution, trying to find acceptance. And it wasn't working for me, and it wasn't working for those folks that I was seeing. Again, and why it wasn't working, I came to believe, was that the premise of trying to find finished was maybe not the most useful thing to do. And that's when I started to make this shift into trying to move out of stages and move into story. And I just quit trying to intervene so much and just made space for folks to tell their story. And I began to see how crucial that was for their loss, to be able to tell the story in such a way that it was a place for that story to be heard, which is why community is so important. But in the doing of it, something important was happening for them. So I really started to do a couple of, on my own studies, I started looking at attachment theory, which then helped me understand that what we're talking about with grief is really the beginning of grief is attachment. It is how we're attached to the one we love that forms our grief. I also looked at a theory called continuing bonds, which is a kind of a research book that was contrary to looking at grief in a more resolution, reconciliation sort of way. It was looking at the ongoingness, particularly with this population of bereaved parents who wanted to have a continuous bond with the one that they love. They didn't want it to be over. They didn't want it to be closed or finished. So the combination of those theories and the ability to step back and create room to make story really created a shift for my clients and a shift for me, because what the simple formula that kind of evolved out of all this is grief is not a diagnosis. Grief is not pathological. Grief is the expression of love. And so people would ask me so many times, how long will I grieve? My question would be, how deeply did you love? That's how long you will grieve. And shifting it out of this diagnostic way of thinking about it, which psychology had really created over the past, all the way back to Freud, really for decades, freed people to not be self-critical about their grief, but to be able to be available to their grief. Because about this time, 80s into the 90s, more and more people were reading the popularized version of Kubler-Ross and coming to my practice self-diagnosed, telling me, I'm stuck in denial. Why aren't I angry? They were using it really as I had used it as a diagnostic tool. And I maintain to this day that the 5 stages of grief has got to be in the top 5 psychological models that are deeply embedded in the culture. That it is when you hang up from our call, Google Homer Simpson and the 5 stages of grief, if you want to see how popularized this is. Now, as you can imagine, Homer zipped through the 5 stages in record time. He was given a terminal diagnosis because he'd eaten some bad fish, I think. And the doctor is explaining to him what he's going to go through, and Homer just blasts through it. But when I see those kind of things, you realize how popularized it is and how accepted it became. No criticism of Kubler-Ross. I mean, again, it got popularized in a way that she may or may not have intended, but to her credit, we're talking about death in ways we never had. Her work with oncology patients and working with this really opened up the door for us to talk about death and dying in a much different way. So that brings me up to where my practice made this shift, and I started shifting in terms of how I approached folks And I started to see people really lean into their grief, not treat it as something that they had to fix or get over, but learn how to integrate their story into their life as they went forward. That takes me up to the point where I want to pitch it to Tim and have him kind of talk through his grief experience and what led him as a writer to what he has written and what led him to want to do this book.
Thanks, Patrick, and hello, everyone. Glad to be with you tonight. It was really a wonderful experience doing this book with Patrick because, all joking aside, we are very, very close friends and see the world in very similar ways. And as he said, admire similar people in terms of spiritual guides. And so I felt like I could, the process was I would interview him and interview him and interview him, and then take that and kind of send it back to him in his voice. But invariably, as we went through this process, things would occur to both of us that neither one of us had thought of before. So it was a very kind of dynamic process. And what my perspective that I brought to it, I'd lost a brother to cancer, and 20 years ago this year, I guess it was, which is a very, obviously a very devastating experience, and was a grieving experience to me. But I think the one criticism of the book that I have is that, and I think we'll probably talk about this later in reference to COVID and the terrible times we're living through right now, living loss, as Patrick says, is that I think the principles of the book, we apply them a little too narrowly, because what we're talking about, I think, is how to suffer well. And we are terrible at suffering. We are loath to, because too often, we see our pain, our sadness, our anger, our depression, our loneliness as character defects. And they're not. Fred, the kind of the patron or the godfathers of this book, I think Patrick would agree, are Henry Nouwen and Fred Rogers. And Fred, one of Fred's famous, or one of my favorite sayings of his is, there's no should or should not when it comes to feelings. They just are. And their origins are often beyond our ability to know. And all we can do, really, is to feel them and to express them in ways that don't hurt other people, and to share them with people we can trust. And Henry Nouwen famously said, what is most personal is most universal. And so if you think about that for a second, what is most personal? Is it the things that we're proud of, the things we're happy about, or is it our grief? Is it our pain? Is it our shame? But we go through life loath to admit to other people and even to ourselves that we feel these things, for fear that if people really knew how we felt, then they really wouldn't like us. Or that if we felt this way, again, there's something wrong with us. And again, Patrick, we've said there are occasions when there's pathology involved in some of these situations, but most often it's just being human. And I think one of the hardest things for a person to do is to learn how to be a good friend to themselves, to accept where they are in their inner life, in their pain and in their joy or whatever it is, without judgment. And one of the things I took from the book is in my own kind of spiritual practice. I tend to try to spend some time every morning just sitting and kind of checking in with myself. And on the days when the world is closing in, when I'm feeling angry or particularly stressed about something, rather than saying that self-critical stuff that so many people show up in Patrick's office saying, what I'm more tempted to say is just simply, you are really suffering today. And try to extend to myself the same kind of compassion that I would extend to a friend. And I think that one of the things we write about in the book is what is called the culture of positivity. Again, this whole notion that unless you have a stiff upper lip and a smile on your face, there's something wrong with you. Well, life's just not that way. You cannot be an authentic human being and live that way. But that is valued in our society. And I think that in a very broad sense, my belief is that what this book is to really help us learn how to be kinder and more compassionate to ourselves, to take away a lot of the self-judgment of where we're at, and just to be friends to ourselves and give ourselves the permission to do what is universally part of the human condition, and that is, to suffer. Henry said, "What is most personal is most universal," and so indeed, the messiness of our insides often is what we have most in common with other people. And I think that this book, and one of the things it does is it makes that point that there's nothing, and Patrick, and when he listens to a story, when we talk about this in the book, he listens to a person lay out the story of the one that was lost and what that person meant to him or her, and the memories they shared, the experiences they shared, the idiosyncrasies that became, et cetera, et cetera. And at the end of it, Patrick can often say, you're not stuck. You're sad. And after everything I just heard, how could it be any other way? And really, I know maybe he would speak to this later, but Patrick still grieves for his son. And I don't think he would trade that, because it is a connection to Ryan. And this suffering that we so try to avoid can be redemptive in so many different ways if it's embraced rather than judged or that we attempt to avoid it. So I think that that is to me that's the broader, and that is the context of my life, is trying to, or the context that I bring to this, and that eventually learning to accept myself and my suffering as it was. And I was talking to a group of guys last night. We were talking about my Mr. Rogers book, and at the end of the thing, I said, the fruits of this honesty and the courage to face the difficult stuff and embrace yourself is ultimately joy and peace. I think that we can reach these things by being authentic. I think that ultimately, of course, the sadness will always be there, but it's a sweet sadness often. So again, I think we give permission to be more more three-dimensionally human. And it has been extremely gratifying for us both to hear that it has indeed lifted the burden of a lot of people who have read it.
Thank you to both of you. Would we like to open the floor up for some questions? If you are interested in asking Dr. O'Malley or Tim Madigan, any questions, you can unmute yourself at the bottom left corner of your screen, or tap your screen if you're on an iPad or a iPhone, or a phone, not just iPhone, tablet or phone. But we're going to open the floor up for questions. So just kind of a free for all. So as you're ready, or you can send me a question directly into the chat as a private message if you would like for me to ask the question.
I have a comment more than a question.
Go ahead.
Okay, first of all, I was a guest at Jane's wedding when she and Simon got married, I think in 1966 or 67. Am I right? Yeah. And I also have the distinguishing characteristic in this group. Tim, you'll be happy to hear this. Mr. Rogers was actually my neighbor. I lived in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania for 38 years, and I lived around the corner from Mr. Rogers. And I was on his show twice.
Really?
He did shows like kind of discussion shows. One was on stepfamilies and one was on children of divorce. And I was in the audience as a professional social worker at the time. So I had planted questions to ask him on those shows. And no, I do not have a video copy of them. I wish I did.
That's very cool.
Yeah, and I guess I do have an observation to make. I alluded to it earlier. How would you recommend that we help people right now in their current situations who are dealing with grief around being alienated from family members or close or old friends because of different or divergent beliefs? And I really believe there's a lot of grief going around as people are confronting many of their relationships in current times and learning about things that they didn't know about people who have been in their circle maybe for a long period of time.
Well, I'll take a run at that. You know, again, the second part in the book, after we talk about how to build the story and look at the chapters of that, we talk about community. And let me go back to death loss for a minute, and then I want to come back to your comment. In Who Amongst Us, on our way to fill in the blank, back when we could do that, on the way to the wake or the way to the house of the bereaved or way to the service, didn't end up, I certainly do still, with an anxiety that's typically brought about by the question of what am I going to say? What can I say to my dear friend who has gone through this loss? And I have to remind myself, and hopefully before I get there, that my real mission is not to speak, but to listen. And to listen in such a way that I am with them. What Alan Wolfelt calls companioning. How do I companion them? And I think that's a great term, and we list all of those in the book, you know, what it means to be a companion. So, you know, what you're describing, I think, Jill, is living loss in terms of fractured relationships. Mm-hmm. And I have, in the last many years of my practice, watched many relationships divorce, sister to sister, tension between spouses, family to family, on both sides of the story. And if I ask myself that question, how is it we connect with folks with whom we may have these differences that, you know, have a light shining on them at some point? I think it's more likely to come down to what we describe in death loss, which is listening and loving. And, you know, that's hard to do. You know, how do we, particularly when we've, you know, I've certainly some relationships in my life, I thought we thought more similarly than we may end up thinking, and have to kind of go through the process. But it's a place to, I think, dig in and look for compassion and understanding and listening. And it's a similar process that likely listening is more powerful than trying to talk or persuade or influence. And I think there will be, unfortunately, some relationships for some folks that just, they can't be repaired. that the fracture in the fission that's happened is such that it's really hard to find their way back to each other. That's an example of living loss. And I think, as we mentioned earlier, we also have to talk about what the pandemic has done to our normal rituals of helping people, both the dying and the bereaved. And I don't have a fancy answer to that, except that it's so important to continue to remember the people who have had a loss during this time. Now, if you look, kind of go through, as I've kind of watched the obituaries from mid-February to now, you've got a whole group of months in which every obituary would say a service at a later time, or a memorial will be held at a certain time. So from February to when things opened up a little bit to June, you had that. And then you had this next group that was kind of in between. And then you've had some that have said, we will meet, but only in this way, or it'll still be private. So again, those rituals and those ways of connecting each other in this current circumstance are interrupted, which means it makes, I think it should motivate us to make an extra effort to figure out how to connect with those folks. Now, folks are doing some creative thing with Zoom services, Zoom funerals and memorials. There's lots of ways trying to do it. And this has been a hard year from what's going on politically, what's going on with the pandemic, what's going on in just other places of the culture. And there is a lot of stress and fatigue, I think. But I would encourage, if you are the friend of someone who is going through this loss, through a loss at this time, that some of these services are getting postponed 3 months, 6 months, it may be up to a year before folks finally gather. And those families need to be cared for during that time in as creative ways as you can to connect with them. And we've also got, the loss within the loss, which is not being able to always have the family gather with the dying person. We talk about grief, and particularly with cancer grief, so much of the time there's an anticipatory grief. It's kind of what you were describing, Jane. You talk about the years of illness that go on and the anticipatory piece of that. And those rituals are getting interrupted because it's not as easy as it used to be to have a whole community support. So again, care for the caregiver, which of course is the mission, one of your missions, which I think is so absolutely essential. Creative ways to try and stay connected, but most of all, don't forget and be with folks side by side in their suffering. And to key off of what Tim was saying, I so many of the folks I see have their grief, and then they have their resistance to the suffering of their grief. And that takes a lot of energy. It takes a lot of energy to resist the natural suffering. And again, when we think about grief as a formation of love, we're loving when we grieve. But when we're resisting that love that we would wish to share with others about, and with ourselves, with the one that we lost. So I answered 2 questions actually in that. So I think, always ask yourself not what I need to say, but how do I learn to listen better? It's so fascinating. I've been a therapist now, whatever it's been, 41 years. And we always thought what we did was helpful, but now we've got more brain science to prove that what's called a rich listening environment actually helps people develop new neural pathways. And we co-regulate our systems. Just fascinating stuff. So many of the folks I see who are grieving, there will be a portion of what we talk about that has to do with how they did not feel connected with their community, or how folks made attempts and really didn't meet them where they were. And we talk a lot about kind of do's and don'ts in the book, and the avoidance of cliches and the avoidance of assuming that, your job is to help them feel better or direct them. Again, I come back to the idea of companioning. But all that's to say, listening is more powerful than we think. It feels passive, but creating space, creating that room. And several of you have had that experience where you're with somebody where your nervous systems are in total sync with one another. And when that happens, you feel safe. You're able to say what you need to say. You're able to express it as you need to express it. And you're not having to put energy into managing that relationship. And that's, I think, a goal for all of us in whatever circumstance we're in order to be a better companion to those who are suffering.
Thank you, Dr. O'Malley. I have a question that came in through the chat.
Mhm.
It says, having lost my spouse in October from the exact same cancer that my first spouse passed away from, I feel like I'm experiencing life is not fair syndrome. It's not really a question, but how do I get out of this phase? Each spouse was 20 years apart.
That's a great comment, a great question, and I hear it and I feel it a lot. I think it's one of our most fundamental values, and you can see this in little kids, that they don't have a whole lot of concepts in place, but they're able to figure out what isn't fair. That there's a belief that it's got to be divided in a certain way. And I see this in my little grandkids. They're arguing about fairness, and I'm not even sure they know what they're talking about, but there's something that they know is wrong. So I would say that's very much part of our humanness, is how do we weigh the scales of that? And I would say, that there's not a solution to that unfairness. It is unfair. Part of that, I think, is can be a part of what our, how we look at ourselves in terms of the big picture, that we ought to, in a way, at least have a level of fairness in our life that is doesn't make us feel like we're on the short end. But grief and loss just doesn't do that. I mean, I think it does feel unfair. So I don't know that it's such a thing to get out of as a thing to recognize, which is what's being said in this statement, that it just, that kind of story just weighs heavily as how could this make sense? You read about the good death, which is someone who's lived their life fully and dies peacefully at an old age. Anything for most people shy of that, there can certainly be an element of inequity, that it isn't going like it ought to go. And, most of the losses that we are describing here have been such that they weren't necessarily that peaceful death at the end of life. They're tragic, they're traumatic, they're premature. And I guess, I'm giving a long answer to the question, but I think how I'd say it is, that's part of the grieving, is to let that be part of your story. If it is feeling like there is an inequity and unfairness, that's part of your story. Own that. It may have a resolution to it at some point, but I think it can become a lot of pressure to say, I'm feeling something I shouldn't be feeling. Like Tim was saying, if we're feeling it, we're feeling it.
Does anybody have another question? I do have one more in the chat. So this one is asking for either of you to just comment on the additional guilt that families are experiencing when they're unable to be with their loved ones in the ICUs when they pass.
You got a thought on that, Tim?
Well, it's kind of what we've been talking about. The circumstances, the horror. To me, one of the great horrors of this pandemic is precisely that: is that loved ones are dying a painful death, excruciating death, and you're saying goodbye on a iPad or a cell phone. It is just inhuman, and so it goes back. I think to what Patrick says. How could it be? How could it be other than what you feel? How could it be other than that horrible guilt? How could it be other than that terrible sadness, that terrible, that traumatic, and in a perfect world, we wouldn't ask the question, what do we do with the guilt? What do we do with the pain? We just go, um, I think that Patrick will chime in here and say, how could you not feel these things? How could you not? And it's not a judgment on anything. It's just, 1 + 1 = 2. And if you have these atrocities being played out over and over again, and that's what I feel like they are a lot of, in so many ways, just inhuman, there's going to be an enormous toll. And I think that the one thing we can do for ourselves is not to make that enormous pain even more painful by judging it, but just kind of hunkering down and say, this is going to suck. This is going to suck, but I'm not going to turn against myself in the process by trying to judge what's going on. I mean, this is hard enough already. And I think that's part of the big premise of the book is grief sucks. Grief is hard. You don't have to make it more difficult than it already is by judging yourself or trying to diagnose yourself. And so that's kind of my intuitive thought about it. It's a horrible, horrible, horrible thing. I think that we as a culture and society and a world are going to be dealing with the lingering psychological impact of this for a long, long time.
In the book, we describe the 4 building blocks of your story, and one is called environmental triggers. What are the things that happen in the world in which we knew our loved one that activate our grief? Another is our individual personalities. How are we wired? An extrovert is going to grieve differently than an introvert. Someone that's more creative may grieve differently than somebody who's more structured. The third is, I think, addressing this question, and that is the circumstances of the death. Was it a traumatic death? Was it an illness-related death? And what we have in the pandemic now is a whole new phenomena added to the circumstances of the death, which is isolation. And, how can we talk about this with much, we don't have any history of this per se. We're 6 months, 9 months into a whole new phenomena of somebody dying in isolation. And so, and the fourth thing we talk about in the building block of our story is our attachment. That makes our grief unique. We're uniquely attached. One of the questions I ask folks is not just who is that person to you, but who did you get to be with that person that you don't get to be with anybody else? Because that's also what you're grieving. But if we go back to these circumstances and the guilt, as was suggested in the question, guilt is often, true guilt. Psychology's not done a great job with guilt, in my opinion, through the years. We've kind of washed it away. Guilt is something you ought to feel if you've done something wrong. What most of us feel is a heavy responsibility. And when we're unable to fulfill that responsibility, then there is that experience of a form of guilt. And when we're unable to perform our responsibility to our loved one who is dying, what greater size of trauma can that be? It's again a loss within a loss. So I agree with Tim. I think we're going to be looking at this for years to come in terms of the impact that this has had, that the pandemic has had. And certainly one of those large features are these just terribly difficult stories of not being able to be with our loved ones when they die, and then not being able to be with our loved ones who support us in our grief. And I think we got a lot of making up to do with folks who we haven't been able to touch and be with and hold as soon as we're able to do that. But I would agree with Tim, if you feel the guilt and you identify it, I do think it's important to say, what did I have control over and what did I not? And that's what I think so many folks are feeling, is they didn't have control in an appropriate way at one of the most profound moments of their life. And so that becomes part of our story too. And so I think the circumstantial, the circumstances of the death is going to have a whole nother narrative associated with it for folks who have experienced loss during the pandemic.
Well, and Dr. O'Malley, I'm so glad you mentioned that, because that's a perfect segue into something I've been reflecting on the book. You and Tim describe the 3 chapters, so to speak, of finding your story versus analyzing your grief. It's easy for me to want to analyze, to put myself in that place. And I lost a dear loved one this summer, and lost due to cancer. We knew this was coming, but it happened quickly, and it happened during a pandemic in the mountains of Pennsylvania where we can't get there. They waited 3 months to do a service. They did it thanks to Facebook streaming and all the ways we have to be connected. But again, you're in the mountains, your internet goes out and in, you don't get the full experience sitting in your living room trying to celebrate someone you've loved forever. And I find myself stuck on trying to write my chapters of who this uncle was to me my whole childhood and adult life, and how to move through a unique situation of a funeral that you didn't really participate in, though you were there, if that makes sense. You're there in a way, but you're not. And I would love your insights on how do I move through my chapters that are definitely unfiltered, as you say.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's it. That is the story. It becomes such a part of the story. And, I think a way, if we'd written this book this year, we would have included more about this, but of course it wasn't such a phenomena, obviously, at the time we wrote it. But what I would say is, part of the longing, I think, is part of the story, is what would I have done if I had freedom to do it? What would that look like? And I think being able to identify what you would have done normally helps you identify what you've lost, because you've lost him and you've lost the opportunity to be a part of the community of him and to be there for his funeral, his celebration, all of those things. So I think folks are going to be journaling about their losses through the time of COVID. That's going to be part of their story. And that'll be part of the story that they end up describing, is how I didn't get to be, here's what I would have done. Here's how it would have gone. And here's how it went. And look at the difference between those two. That's its loss in itself. So I think that may be part of the exercise, is to write the comparison of what would have been otherwise, so that you're clear on what it is you lost.
Thank you.
I have another comment from the chat, is to talk a little bit about this individual feels like they need to act like they're okay, so their family and friends don't worry about them, but it's exhausting to continue to put on this facade. So can either of you comment a little bit about this?
Yeah, we tell a story in the book about somebody describing that, and I hear that description so much. And it's the term I use is social splitting, where I have to act better than I feel. And it is exhausting. And, folks get into that circumstance for various reasons. We meaning our particular world that we live in this country, don't have very generous bereavement policies. That's getting some attention because some folks in high places that run big companies have gone through losses, and like many things, that's where things change. If somebody with some power has a loss and they start to look at it. But what that often means is that you're back to work within 3 to 5 days. If you don't have any time off, you're having to act as if you're not grieving. The other reason, and this may be kind of inferred in this comment, is how you manage that energy of I'm managing people managing me, if that makes sense. I'm watching you watch me grieve, and it's uncomfortable. And there are some people that just aren't feeling emotionally safe to express their grief. There's others that just are more introverted and would prefer a more private approach to it. What I talk to folks about in my practice is trying to make sure that they have some space in which they don't have to exert that energy. And that may be with a very, very trusted person who can companion with them and hold them. And that may be that they just sit when they can get a few minutes and journal, but that they've got a safe space. I don't want to say social splitting is something diagnosable. I think we all do it. I think it's a matter to how much. And sometimes it's forced, and sometimes it just doesn't feel safe otherwise. And sometimes it's a matter of managing your energy, because grief takes energy. And if you're in a circumstance that you don't have a lot of space for that, then you're back having to perform and function again pretty quickly after the loss. So I think knowing that that's, so much of understanding grief is normalizing it and acknowledging it, and understanding that social splitting is very exhausting, and it is hard to manage grief. Grief is, we don't think of these two words together, but grief is a form of stress. It is pressure on our system, physical, spiritual, psychological, cognitive, all of those. And, there's a theory I like that talks about an oscillation in grief between what was and what's still not yet to be. I just wrote that, if you take my blog, I wrote a blog called Liminality. It's about how in grief we live in this space between what was and what's not yet. And that it's a very disorienting place to be oftentimes, because our new life is not yet formed, and we are still very attached to the life we had with our loved one. So grief is stressful. Grief takes energy, and the social side of that is very much so. I'm just a proponent, when possible, of support groups, and the more specific, the better, because that's a place where everybody checks their self-criticism at the door. When you're in a grief support group, you're there with fellow travelers. And I will often have folks tell me that they had more intimate community with strangers than they did with folks they'd known for years, because there was just no judgment. And there wasn't this effort to try and get helped by their friends. And that's not talking about folks having bad intentions. I think folks try to help because that this feels like the right thing to do. But I also, when possible, encourage that the kind of counterpoint to social splitting is to find safe places where you can be present to your feelings, where you can make room for the suffering that is because of the love that you had for the one you lost.
Thank you, Dr. O'Malley. Another question is, generally, how long does it take to formulate one's story? It seems that it can only be fully developed when one can look back with some sort of perspective.
Yeah. You want to do that, Tim?
Just kind of talking about what we write in the book is that the story of the attachment, the story of the loss, really never ends, right? Don't we say that, Patrick?
We do.
It changes, and so so the perspective that you might seek in one place is going to be different than what happens down the road. And I think Patrick talks about how he's had clients come in after many years who basically have come in, they're in a much different phase of the story of their grief than they were 15 years ago. And they want to share that. And to use my friend as an example, the story of his grief continues. It is a very organic thing. And isn't it interesting, though, that runs contrary to what kind of the popularized goal of grieving has been for so long, which is to reach closure, to reach acceptance, which suggests that when you get to this point and have achieved this goal, you go back to life as it was prior to the loss. And I don't think that's possible. I think it's very, I just don't think it's possible. And rather than closure, it's a new chapter, a new chapter and a new chapter and a new chapter. And is that what people want to hear? A lot of people is that what they want to hear? Is that, you mean this is going to continue? Well, yeah, I guess it does. But that's life. That's life. And if you frame it in terms of, and I believe this too forever, is that grief is one of the most powerful expressions of love there is. If you can look at it that way, maybe you don't want it to end. But did I get that right, Patrick? Am I regurgitating our findings correctly?
When we talk about the 3 chapters, we say it's not the normal story because the story doesn't end. But I think the question's an important one, because I would say sooner to the loss, it is going to be a very different perspective. You haven't, that chapter 3 in its earliest forms can only have so much to it. That's why we look at the chapter 3 as an ongoing story. And I have folks who will, write monthly about their experience, pull it out once a year and write some more. Here's what this year's looked like. But I would say to the question, the closer to the beginning of chapter 3, there's just less clock hours, so to speak. There's less time spent in that chapter, which is why I think not seeing that as a task to complete, I've got to finish my chapter 3. But to what Tim was saying and how we talk about it in the book, chapter 3 is the ongoing continuation of the story. And over time, people will write about how grief changes over time. How does that integrate into our story long term? My favorite spiritual writer says, if we can allow ourselves to suffer, it can transform us. It can be transformative. We don't have to find suffering or go looking for suffering to transform. But when we resist that suffering, the way this person writes, is we end up transmitting that pain rather than letting that pain transform us. So part of the chapter 3 is to look at those transformations. And that's a tricky thing to say. It's not saying, I'm so glad I went through this loss so I could have this spiritual growth. A loss happens, but staying present to the suffering creates that kind of growth. But I think, what we're saying to this question is the story doesn't end. It changes over time. And I find folks who have written periodically through the years find this very helpful to go through and really reread what they wrote because of what the long story looks like.
I wanted to just throw something out here because I think it's really interesting, and so much of Patrick's theory, about grieving is based on attachment, and I think that wasn't the equation something to the effect of the extent and duration of your grief is going to be commensurate with the amount of your love, but attachment. I don't think many of us have fairy tale attachments, have fairy tale relationships, have fairy tale marriages, have fairy tale relationships with our siblings or our friends. They're human relationships are very complicated things. And so one of the things that Patrick encourages people to explore, to be realistic about the complexities of their relationship. And it's not all going to be walks along the beach at sunset. There's going to be things said over a course of a relationship that one regrets and probably or perhaps never had the opportunity to make amends for. And so in addition to the sadness, I think there's going to be regret, and there's going to maybe some anger, and this probably as many feelings as there are different degrees of complexity of human relationship. And one of the things that that Patrick or we write about in the book is that, what about really rotten relationships? What about abusive relationships? And Patrick has treated people, and we write about in the book, I've treated people who are saying, I just feel terrible because I'm just not sad. They feel emancipated rather than sad. And again, Patrick can speak to this, but like that's part of the story. These stories are three-dimensional. They're real. And sometimes, or I think for most of us, I think if we were to be real about the story of life, I mean, it's going to have some ins and outs and ups and downs, and some regrets and some angers and some sorrows. And I think we encourage people to kind of embrace that reality too. Am I right, Patrick?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the fair balance to this question of attachment. And I'm glad you brought that up, because it is easy to idealize. But, and the way we've structured the back part of the book, there's questions sprinkled throughout to help you form your story. And then there's very direct questions that can be done in a group or done individually. But I do tell the story of a complex attachment and the guilt for not feeling worse that often happens. But if we're staying true to our thought that attachment defines grief, well, then complicated attachment is a grief story too. And oftentimes the work I do with folks who have those kinds of losses is we talk about the loss of the relationship that was not while they were alive. It's not the relationship that was, because for many of these, primary relationships that are abusive or aggressive or difficult to deal with, the loss isn't what didn't happen that should have. And that's the process that we look at. But that's a thing that people can feel a great deal of shame about. And they kind of whisper, I don't know what's wrong with me. I'm feeling relief because of what happened. I'm feeling emancipated. These are hard stories to hear. But again, it's the value and the sacredness of that story, because the story is complex. And there wasn't what we think of as normal, healthy attachment. And so that creates a bit of complication for the grief. But in healthy attachment, to Tim's point, we're still, to use Tim's word, there's still messiness. And that's part of being honest with our story, is to understand our failings and maybe the failings of the one we loved. We were in an imperfect relationship, and we may have all done our best, but we still have some things that kind of come back to us that we wonder about if we could have done differently. All part of the same story of honesty about the loss.
I think that whether it's complicated attachment or whatever the stories of attachment and stories of loss are as numerous as the stars in the sky. But whatever they are, and I've been on the receiving end of this with Patrick. I've gotten, in addition to whatever royalties from the book I've earned, I've gotten some free counseling from him. And here's why he's so effective. And it goes back to again what he made reference to earlier, is that he is the best listener I've ever known. Right up there with Fred Rogers. That he is, and I've shared some very painful and personal things with him. They both take things in totally without judgment and without any kind of agenda of their own, and are just fully present to the person they're with. And then what comes back is something that comes from a very pure and sacred place. I raise this because it's not just Patrick. Every one of you, especially in the profession you're in, I think know what I'm talking about. That I just think that the greatest gift that you can give to your clients is precisely that, is that just that pure sense of presence without an agenda. And the older I get, the more I see the power of that. and one of the reasons it's so powerful, unfortunately, I think, is because it's so rare. How often do you really feel heard? You know, how often do you really feel seen? And I think in a very simplistic sense, what a grieving person wants is to feel heard and seen. And they tell Patrick a story, and and basically says, no wonder you're feeling that way. And I think he's probably cost himself a lot of clients by saying, you're not screwed up. You're just, geez, anybody would be feeling the way, and they're liberated from the sense of shame so they can go, and, but it's that very simple but profound act of human generosity when you just can kind of empty yourself of your own preoccupations, your fears, your agendas, your opinions, and be wholly present to another human being. And again, as I said, I've witnessed or I've experienced that with Patrick and Fred Rogers, and fortunately many other people. But ultimately, at the end of the day, I think whether you're a griever or the one supporting the griever, I think that is the principle that is, to me, is most important and more important than any other.
We have about 10 minutes left. I want to thank both Tim Madigan and Dr. O'Malley for coming on today. Becky and myself are going to be sending everybody an email sometime tomorrow to make sure that we're going to send this recording to you, because as I've heard about the book, that sometimes you need to see or read something twice to really get it. So we'll send the recording as well as the book link if you're interested in making a purchase of the book and reading it and going through the steps. And then I'm also going to make sure to send both the website. I know Dr. O'Malley mentioned something about a blog, so I'm going to find his blog and I'm going to send that link to you as well. So I think this was a very, very wonderful discussion, and I appreciate everybody for using the chat and communicating with me to be able to communicate your questions and your thoughts. And I'm going to let Jane Odeberg close us out.
Well, I too thank Dr. O'Malley and Tim for, I can't believe the time went by so fast. And I even learned something else. I always learn something from the two of you, and I hope that all of you who joined us for this Zoom event learned something as well, and will continue to learn. And if you haven't read the book, go get the book. It's on Amazon. But lots of things to think about, and I cannot say how much I appreciated spending the time with all of you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. It was great to be here tonight.